ready to really dive deep into Mindsight. We're using those excerpts you shared from Daniel Siegel's book.
Okay.
Not to, like, summarize the whole thing,
Right.
but to really unearth those aha
Mm.
moments about the mind and the brain and how they shape our connections with others.
And what's really fascinating about Siegel's work is how he manages to blend these complex neuroscience ideas with really relatable stories and examples.
Yeah.
It's not just theory, right? It's about how these concepts actually show up in our everyday life.
Exactly. So let's start with kind of the big idea here. Mindsight.
Okay.
What exactly are we talking about when we say that word? It's more than just self-awareness, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
You could think of Mindsight as this incredible ability to kind of hit the pause button on your autopilot and actually look at your own thoughts and feelings with a lot more clarity.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like an inner zoom lens, right?
Okay.
And here's the key. It also lets us tune into the inner worlds of other people.
Yeah.
And that helps us cultivate deeper connections and understanding.
Okay, so I'm starting to see why this is more than just like another self-help buzzword.
Right.
But how does understanding this inner world, like you're talking about, how does that actually lead to having better relationships or feeling more resilient in our lives?
Well, Siegel talks about this patient, Barbara.
Okay.
And after she had a brain injury, her outward appearance was the same, but her ability to connect with her loved ones, to experience empathy, essentially, her mindset was totally different.
Wow.
And it just highlights how crucial this often invisible part of ourselves is. It plays a huge role in how we experience life and relationships.
That's a powerful illustration of
Yeah.
how important mindsight is, and
Yeah.
something I think that a lot of us take for granted until it's impacted in some way.
Absolutely.
Now, Siegel connects this whole concept of mindsight to the science of neuroplasticity.
Right.
For those who haven't heard that term before, what does that really mean?
So neuroplasticity is this incredible ability of the brain to adapt and change throughout our lives. It really challenges that old belief that we're stuck with the brain we're born with, right?
Right.
Through focused attention and practice, we can literally reshape those neural pathways in our brains. It's kind of like strengthening a muscle.
So it's not just about understanding our minds, but it's about actively shaping how they work.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fascinating. And Siegel uses a really interesting analogy to kind of explain this further. The hand model of the brain.
Right.
I don't know if you want to get into that a little bit.
Yeah, so I mean, instead of getting lost in where to put your fingers, imagine your middle finger is like this crucial part of your brain called the prefrontal cortex.
Okay.
And specifically, that middle prefrontal cortex is like the very tip of your fingernail.
Okay.
That tiny little area acts like your brain's control center.
Okay.
It's involved with things like self-awareness, empathy, and even moral judgment.
It's like the CEO of your brain.
Exactly.
Making those executive decisions.
Yes. And to emphasize how important it is, Siegel actually talks about his own low road experience.
Yes. Tell me about this.
So he had this moment, right, where he temporarily lost access to those prefrontal functions, and it wasn't pretty.
Oh, no.
He described it as a mindsight meltdown.
Wow.
He felt completely disconnected from his kids. He even, like, yelled at his son for something really minor.
It's a good reality check.
Yeah.
That even someone who's, dedicated his life to studying the mind can still struggle with these things.
Yeah.
But it also shows that developing mindsight isn't about, like, achieving some perfect state of Zen or anything like that. It's about building those skills to navigate the bumps in the road.
Exactly. It's about recognizing, okay, I'm slipping into that low road thinking,
Yeah.
and having tools to steer ourselves back to a place of clarity and connection.
Now, what happens in a world where mindsight is absent? Not just individually, but on, like, a larger scale.
Right.
Siegel shares a pretty eye-opening experience from his medical school days that kind of speaks to this.
Yeah, it's almost hard to believe, but he was actually reprimanded for wanting to understand his patients' emotional experiences and their stories.
Wow.
The general attitude at the time was very much focused on the technical parts of medicine, no time for tears, just the facts kind of mentality.
It seems so counterintuitive to what we know now about, like, the mind-body connection and everything.
I know, right.
But it highlights just how ingrained this lack of mindsight can be, even in professions that are dedicated to caring for others.
Yeah, and it really makes you think how this lack of mindsight, right? Like how it might still be impacting us today in different areas of our lives in ways that we don't even realize.
Yeah, for sure.
But Siegel doesn't just kind of critique this absence of mindsight.
Right.
He also offers this really powerful alternative perspective.
Okay.
He challenges that idea that the mind is simply the brain by suggesting that it's actually something much bigger, something built on energy and information that's flowing not just within our own brains,
Okay.
but also between them as well.
Okay, now that sounds really intriguing.
Yeah.
What does he mean by, like, between brains? How does that even work?
Okay, so think of it like this. Your mind uses energy, like from your sensations and your emotions, and it kind of transforms it into information, right?
Okay.
And this information then ends up guiding your actions, which in turn actually use energy and can influence your interactions with others.
Okay.
It's this constant feedback loop. And
Okay.
these loops actually extend beyond just our individual minds to create kind of like the fabric of our relationships and our shared experiences.
So it's like our minds are constantly in conversation.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Shaping each other,
Yeah,
even without us realizing it.
absolutely.
That's a really powerful concept to kind of get your head around.
It is.
And it makes me think about this idea of integration, which is another key concept that Siegel talks about in the book.
Right, and this is where I think we can start to see some of the real-world implications of Mindsight, because Siegel says that well-being isn't about achieving this perfectly calm and always happy state, right?
Right. Yeah.
It's actually about integration. It's
Yes.
about bringing together all these different aspects of ourselves, our emotions, our thoughts, our experiences, even our relationships into a more harmonious whole.
So instead of trying to, like, quiet or ignore parts of ourselves that we find undesirable or whatever, it's more about recognizing and, like, accepting them.
Exactly. It's about acknowledging all parts of ourselves, even the messy ones.
But how do we actually do that? You know what I mean?
Right.
Especially when those parts might feel very chaotic or like they're in conflict with each other.
Absolutely. And that's, I think, where those 9 middle prefrontal functions that we talked about earlier come in.
Right.
Remember that, like
Ah.
CEO of the brain, right?
Right. Yeah.
So these functions are kind of like its key departments, right? Or
Okay.
its tools for integration.
Right. So like regulating our emotions,
Mhm.
being able to understand and respond to other people, being flexible in our thinking.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, that's a pretty impressive list when you think about it.
It is a pretty amazing capacity that we have as humans, and it really highlights how this one area of the brain plays such a vital role in our overall well-being.
Yeah.
And this is where it gets, I think, even more interesting. Siegel explains how these functions that we're talking about
Yeah.
can actually be really deeply impacted by trauma.
This is such an important aspect of mental health, I think, that, we're understanding more and more.
Absolutely.
And I think Siegel's approach to this whole idea of trauma is really fascinating.
Yeah.
He talks about how our brains are almost like hardwired to remember threats,
All right.
and that sometimes they can hold on to those memories in ways that can be incredibly debilitating.
Right. And what's often happening is that these really intense experiences, these traumatic experiences,
Yeah.
they actually get kind of embedded in what's called implicit memory.
Okay.
And it just means that on a conscious level, we might not actually remember the event itself, but our body, our emotions, they remember, and so they react, right?
Right. So that would explain why, we might feel triggered in certain situations
Yeah.
without fully understanding, like, why am I reacting this way?
Exactly.
This doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and it's like our body has its own intelligence, separate from our conscious thoughts.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, and Siegel introduces this concept of the checker, right?
Okay.
Which is this part of our brain that's constantly scanning for danger.
Hmm.
Think of it like, an internal alarm system.
Okay.
Now, this system is meant to keep us safe, but sometimes, especially after we've experienced trauma,
Right.
this checker can become like overactive, right?
Okay.
Leading to things like anxiety, panic attacks, even OCD, obsessive compulsive behavior.
Right. And he illustrates this, I think, with the case of Sandy, this young girl who's struggling with OCD.
Yes, exactly. And Sandy had developed this compulsion to tap on things.
Oh.
And through working with her, Siegel realized that this seemingly insignificant behavior was actually her way of trying to manage the really intense anxiety that was being triggered by this overactive checker.
It just shows you how important it is to understand the why behind our behaviors.
Absolutely.
And how, something like trauma can manifest in ways that we don't always expect.
Right, and I think it also speaks to the power of Mindsight as like a therapeutic tool, because by helping Sandy to understand the neuroscience behind her anxiety and her OCD, and by teaching her these mindfulness techniques to actually calm down that overactive checker, Siegel was able to help her regain a sense of control and agency over her experience.
It's amazing how empowering it can be to just, like, understand these underlying mechanisms.
Absolutely.
But moving on, Siegel also talks about the really important role that early childhood experiences play, especially when we're thinking about attachment theory.
Right.
What's he have to say about that?
Yeah, so he argues that those early relationships, and especially with our primary caregivers,
Yeah.
create this kind of blueprint for how we're going to connect with other people throughout our lives. And he uses this, I think, really interesting research called the strange situation experiment to
Yes.
really illustrate
I've
this.
heard of that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, it's where they observe how babies react when they're separated from their caregivers, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And what they found is that babies display these really distinct attachment styles.
Yeah.
Secure, avoidant, ambivalent, disorganized, all based on those interactions with their caregivers.
Yeah.
And these early patterns, even though they're often unconscious,
Yeah.
can really influence how we approach relationships in adulthood.
So someone who had a secure attachment in childhood might be more likely to form healthy, trusting relationships later in life.
Right.
While someone with an insecure attachment style might struggle with intimacy or have a fear of abandonment or something like that.
Yeah, that's the general idea.
Sure.
And Siegel actually uses the example of Stewart, who's this man in his 80s, to show how these attachment patterns can play out over the course of a really long-term relationship.
Hmm.
So Stewart really struggled with things like emotional intimacy and vulnerability, and he would often push his partner away, even though he really craved that close connection.
Wow. So it's incredible how these early experiences
Yeah.
can have such a lasting impact on us, even, well into adulthood.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that even though we're hardwired for these patterns,
Yeah.
Siegel shows that they're not our destiny, right?
Okay.
There's always a possibility for change and growth.
That's good.
And that's kind of a hopeful message, I think,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
Because even later in life, we can start to understand those old wounds and begin to heal those patterns.
It's never too late, right?
Exactly, exactly. And Siegel really highlights the importance of attunement in this process.
Okay.
That ability to truly see and respond to another person's inner world with a lot of empathy and understanding.
Right. Yeah.
It's about creating that safe and secure space where vulnerability and connection can actually flourish.
I love that.
Me too. And it makes me think about how these themes of connection actually weave into even the tougher aspects of being human,
Okay.
because Siegel doesn't shy away from these topics. He also explores how our developing prefrontal cortex also has to grapple with this inevitability of uncertainty
Right.
and ultimately, death.
It's the one thing that unites all humans, Jack,
Exactly.
is that at some point, this is something that we're all going to face.
Yeah.
This is something that we all face at some point, but it's often pushed aside or avoided.
Yeah.
How does Siegel approach this rather daunting topic?
Yeah, he doesn't really sugarcoat it.
Oh,
He
huh.
acknowledges that as our prefrontal cortex matures, we become more aware of things like time and our own mortality.
Okay.
And, this awareness can be kind of scary.
Yeah.
It often brings with it this sense of existential worry, this fear of the unknown.
That makes sense. It's like a natural part of human development,
It is.
but not always a comfortable one.
Definitely not. But here's the thing. Siegel suggests that instead of trying to, outrun these anxieties, we can actually learn to approach them with curiosity
Okay.
and even, acceptance.
Not trying to shut them down or pretend they're not there,
Yeah.
but really leaning into them a little bit.
Exactly. And he actually shares the story of Tommy, this 12-year-old boy who's consumed with anxiety about death.
Wow, 12 years old.
I know.
That's so young to be dealing with those kinds of thoughts.
It is, and yet it's not that uncommon,
Yeah.
But what I think is really remarkable about Tommy's story is how learning these simple mindfulness techniques
Okay.
really helped him to relate to his fears differently,
Go.
He didn't have to make them disappear. He just learned how to observe them without being completely overwhelmed by them.
That's such a powerful example of how, Mindsight can give us these tools to, navigate those inevitable challenges, even the really, really tough ones.
And, it also makes me think about what Siegel talks about with his friend Angela,
Right.
who's dealing with this life-threatening illness.
Oh, wow.
And here Siegel was, right?
Okay.
Not only confronted with his own mortality, but also with the very real possibility of losing someone he really cared about.
Yeah, and I can imagine how easy it would be in that situation.
Oh, absolutely.
For, your own anxieties to just completely take over.
Completely. And he even admits to feeling that urge to control the situation.
Yeah.
To find the right answers, the best course of treatment.
Right, there's one right way to do this.
Exactly. But Ultimately, what Siegel realized is that he had to make a conscious decision to just step back
Yeah.
and really truly listen to what Angela needed and what she wanted, even if it didn't perfectly align with his own ideas about what was best.
That must have taken incredible strength
It did.
and self-awareness to, like, even recognize that in himself.
Absolutely. And it's those qualities, right, that we've been talking about that are cultivated through Mindsight.
Right.
And what's beautiful about it is that in that act of letting go of control, of surrendering to the uncertainty of it all,
Hmm.
Siegel actually discovered a much deeper level of compassion, not just for Angela,
Wow.
but for himself as well.
That's beautiful.
Isn't it?
Yeah. It's a good reminder that, like, sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is actually embrace the unknown
Yeah.
and just be present, even when it's hard.
Be present. Find that peace in the present moment.
And that's, I think, ultimately what Siegel's really getting at with this whole concept of mindsight.
It
It's not
is.
just a path to personal growth, but it's a path to this more compassionate and connected way of being.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we're not alone in our experiences, in our joy, in our sorrow, in our fears, and our longings.
Yeah.
And that, in and of itself, is such a profound source of strength and resilience.
And Siegel leaves us with this really powerful quote from Einstein
It
that I
does.
think really captures this.
Yeah.
Einstein said, "Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison of self-centeredness by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty."
Wow.
I know, right?
It's a lot to unpack.
It's a lot, but it's like the perfect distillation of everything we've been talking about.
It really is, and Siegel actually talks about how he observed this widening circle of compassion in his own patients.
Really?
Yeah, he saw that as they developed this greater mindsight, their capacity for empathy expanded beyond just themselves,
Wow.
beyond their immediate circle, to encompass this much greater understanding of, like, the interconnectedness of all things.
Like, as we become more attuned to our own inner world,
Yeah.
we also become more attuned to the experiences of others and to the natural world around us.
Precisely. And I think that is the true promise of Mindsight, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a path to personal growth. It's a path to a more compassionate and connected way of being in the world.
Beautifully said. So, to our listener, as you're reflecting on all these different ideas,
Yeah.
here's a question to kind of ponder. What would it look like for you to widen your own circle of compassion?
That's a good question.
Where can you start to practice mindsight in your own life, in your relationships, in your community, in the world around you?
Because that's where the real transformation happens when we
Yeah.
take these insights
Right.
and we turn them into action, into a way of living that is more present, more connected, and more compassionate.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the world of mindsight.
Okay.
We hope you found it insightful and maybe even a little bit transformative.